segue into the next speaker, which is indeed Nancy Doyle. We're now joined by Dr. Nancy Doyle, CEO of Genius Within, a research fellow at Birkbeck, University of London. Genius Within is a social enterprise working in the UK and the USA, delivering support for employers, employees, and in managing neurodiversity at work. Dr. Doyle will be joined by Uzma Waseem, a business psychologist who specializes in talent assessment, leadership development, and executive and performance coaching, to present on the topic of intersectional inclusion in the workplace. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Colman. So I'm just going to kick off here. And what we're essentially challenging here is really the research approach and the latent efforts applied across the neurodiversity paradigm, not the neurodiversity movement itself. And Nancy and I have had quite a discussion around this, and what we question is the value brought by the more constructivist nature in terms of the research methodology and the implications of this across the knowledge that is then being built overall for the wider community. So how is it placed, and should we be expanding our horizons is a question that we ask, and is there something that we can do in terms of learning from adjacent theoretical research? And through that lens, we want to take this discussion further with all of you in terms of whether neurodiversity is systemically classist, racist and sexist, and potentially ableist. So I'd like to bring in Nancy Doyle to take this further. So Nancy, how do you situate yourself in the neurodiversity paradigm?
Thank you, Uzma. So I, in the neurodiversity paradigm, stand at the intersection of being female, having a diagnosis of ADHD that I received in my late 30s, because for my generation, ADHD wasn't an available condition for women or for girls in the 80s and 90s. I also stand at the intersection of whiteness and the knowledge that my ADHD may have destroyed my schooling, but it did not give me a criminal record. And so, although I was truant and absent from school, I was not penalised for that in a kind of behavioural disciplinary way. So I think there's kind of, those are my personal lenses. And then with my professional lens, I stand as a practitioner and an academic, and a reluctant academic, a practitioner who went into academia because I was fed up with having no research that could inform my practice, and wanting to really shine a light on where the gaps are and what we needed to understand more about in order to increase inclusion. And just to be clear, I've worked in disability inclusion since I was 18 years old. I started as a support worker for adults with learning disabilities and physical disabilities, and I have kind of quite a broad view of what we're talking about when we're talking about neurodiversity, and neurominorities for me are a subset within that. So that's me situated. How about you, Uzma? How do you situate yourself in the neurodiversity paradigm?
Right, okay, so it's probably not as extensive as that, Nancy, but I certainly come from perhaps a hybrid of personal experience, not necessarily my own lived experience, but as an outsider. And I'll go into that in a bit more detail, but also from a professional perspective as well, because as an organisational psychologist and working within the talent development mainstream, this is something that has really been brought to my attention. So from a personal perspective, I am in an ADHD affected relationship. So my partner is a specialist consultant in the medical profession and has ADHD with combined presentation. I also have two nephews, aged between 9 and 11, on the autism spectrum, one displaying signs and symptoms that we believe are characteristic of other possible neurodiverse diagnoses. So when it comes to my partner, to avoid compromising his profession, so this is where my interest really sort of stem from, my vested interest. He has a strong care of duty as a doctor. He is completely work focused. There is no work-life balance as a result. I'm not going to go into the history of why it got to that point. And as an ADHD partner, I find that there's a shadow sense of learned helplessness from both our perspectives. There's a level of dependency from both our experiences, that over time has really impeded our collective well-being because of these relational stresses. And the dynamic in our life has now become exhausting to maintain. We have 4 children. We live apart. We are very much a bonded family, but not in the physical sense.
Thank you for sharing all of that. That's really helpful. And I think, what's jumping out at me is what's always jumped out at me as a psychology practitioner in this field, which is, where is the evidence, where is the insight, where is the research that will help us work out those kind of gnarly problems? How do we apply theories such as work-life balance into the experience of neurominorities and neurominority families? So coming from an occupational psychology background like yourself, talent management, assessment, placing people in jobs they can do well, which, your husband can do, but where is the buffer for that to then, how do we then experience work-life balance, and what are the differences there? So one of the things that I did when I started researching was what all psychologists do, which is a literature review. And I did something called an empty systematic review. And that's where you take systematic review principles, which is to formulate your question in advance, be very rigorous about what your inclusion criteria are, and to define in advance what your quality criteria are for what kind of studies that you will accept. And here's the results of kind of 2 elements of that review, which I think is worth drawing our attention to. So specifically looking for neurominority conditions to draw out best practice, best evidence to support individuals like Uzma's husband and wider populations of people within neurodiversity. These are the numbers. So looking at psychology journals, I'm getting hits for dyslexia, I'm getting hits for autism, not so much for DCD, which stands for developmental coordination disorder or dyspraxia, not so much for ADHD, not so much for Tourette syndrome, and an absolutely overwhelming amount of hits for mental health conditions that are mild to moderate, such as anxiety and depression. So we can see from the prevalence rates in the population, when we look at 10% for dyslexia compared to 16% for mental health, that there is a research bias where neurominority conditions are under-researched compared to mental health and compared to other disabling conditions. The other thing that I looked at was, when is that research happening? So has that changed over the years? And what I found is that since 2005, we've had an explosion of autism research and a kind of real drop-off in dyslexia research. Dyslexia is no longer cool. Autism is very cool, dyslexia not cool. ADHD is getting a little bit cooler. Tourette syndrome has never been cool. It's still definitely not cool. And so we've got these kind of biases in terms of what we're looking at, and they're not proportionate to the population prevalence of the conditions. And they're also not proportionate to the experience of individuals with those conditions. So, ADHD, 25% of the prison population have ADHD, yet people with ADHD are twice as likely to start a business when they graduate. So there's something going on there about, why aren't we looking at that? In terms of dyslexia, around 50% of the prison population are dyslexic. A lot of those will be overlapping with the ADHDers, and around a third of unemployed people are dyslexic. So we've got some real issues in terms of the level of social inclusion and our responsibility as workplace practitioners to include, and then the evidence that we've got to look at to help inform our practice specific to this client group. The other graph that you can see on the screen is my review of high quality intervention studies. So that's just, the first one is just studies that name those conditions. So it's really a kind of narrative study, how often are these conditions referred to in research in general? There's no looking at what kind of papers those are. So as a practitioner, what I want to know is what works, what helps, how do I support individuals in the workplace? How do I make sure that talent is realised, is recruited, and and people are working at their best? And so when I was looking for those sorts of studies, I only found 48. And then this is the result of breaking and I widened it from psychology into, general research. And I only found 48 high quality intervention evaluation studies of how to support neurominorities in the workplace, or neurodivergent people, neurodiverse people. And these are the breakdown of what kind of journals they're in. And as you can see, only one came from neuroscience, but a sample check from the other side, so a sample check from the greeny blue graph, was that 62% of the papers published in psychology were within the neuroscience paradigm. So we've got this kind of neuroscience is looking at these conditions and not actually being able to then inform practice. And so there's other disciplines involved. And I'm kind of interested, Uzma, for you, kind of coming into this field, these are some things that I found looking in my own kind of field for ideas and direction. How have you felt, both as a psychologist and as an individual, related to your lived experience around, what's missing from the research? What should we be looking at?
Okay, so this is, this took a lot of sense making, a lot of thought process for me to be able to make that connect, because in terms of my lived experience, I very much can talk about that quite fluently and quite comfortably. However, when it comes to the my professional experience in practice, I see very little in terms of what I can reflect on, to be fair. So I looked at it in terms of taking a step back and then just look and sort of breaking away. So from the front line, that very community that is being marginalised, that are being impacted, what are the symptoms that I've witnessed and what are the symptoms that I've experienced myself? And just to take the example, if I may, of my two nephews that are autistic. What I've very personally witnessed, and this doesn't just apply to family alone, but in the wider ethnic community that I personally identify with, while there is clear concern for the child's future, talk around this is short-lived when the topic comes up. For whatever reason, the discussion always centres on dogmatising the primary caregiver, or the mum, to the point of shame, blaming and dehumanising. So that's one of the symptoms that I see. So I asked myself, what of the child, the very child that is impacted and affected by, this condition? And those around the affected neurodiverse child are now defensive in their approach concerning this condition. So this is what I see moving forward. They're masking them, not the actual child, in every way and form in the battle for social acceptance. And this, what I see in my inference, is being role modelled by the primary caregivers and those around the child. A condition is now deliberately being hidden beyond what is inherently already invisible. Why is this happening? Is it ignorance? Is it lack of information, arming those that are directly or indirectly impacted? They are meant to be the very resource to nurture this child at an early stage. This is the education for that child.
And I think I've been talking to a woman called Elizabeth Tachi, who runs a company called Aspire to Inspire Dyslexia in South London. And she finds that the community of people she's supporting are majority Black, Asian and minority ethnic people. And her view is that within some Black and Asian communities, actually the stigmatization that we're not currently seeing in the autism at work paradigm is actually still rife, is really quite embedded, and there's less acceptance and more shame than there might be in white communities. What's your kind of view on that? Do you experience that? Do you recognize it?
I do in some respect, and I'm also seeing a comment here by Serena Joseph, who's asked if we are seriously underdiagnosing children and ethnic minorities because of the cultural stigma. That's the intersection there already. Yeah. Not only is perhaps, and this is something that we can reflect on later in the discussion, because it just follows on from the research that you identified, where it is broken down disproportionately. But yes, the cultural bias also comes into it as well. Yes, I do tend to see that. But at the end of the day, if there is a lack of information, arming those that are directly meant to be supporting the child, can that ignorance be uplifted?
Mm.
You know,
And arming employers who are supporting parents, and arming employers about the intersectional issues. There is a diagnosis deficit, and I think, you know, that diagnosis deficit isn't unidirectional. So I hear what you're saying about, you know, increased stigma and a desire to pretend that everything's fine. But what we also find is that people of colour are more likely to be diagnosed with personality and conduct disorders than they are to be diagnosed with autism or ADHD or dyslexia. Women are more likely to be diagnosed with anxiety disorders, personality disorders. I was myself diagnosed with an anxiety disorder and an eating disorder before my ADHD was identified in my 30s. And the only reason that it was identified at all is because the rules used to be that you had to have symptoms before the age of 7. And then when I was in my late 30s, that rule changed because the American Psychiatric Association realized that they were missing all the girls because we're socialized to behave differently. And so when they changed the rules that symptoms had to be present before the age of 12, all of a sudden that opened it up to female diagnosis. But we've got all of these biases in the teachers that are reporting behavioral symptoms, parents that may be reluctant to report and put their hand up, the clinicians that may be biased in interpreting symptoms. And so we've got this kind of big, overwhelming, what I call the diagnosis deficit. And then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, doesn't it? Because if you kind of think about the neurodiversity movement, what do you see, Uzma? You know, do you see people like your nephews, people like your husband represented? You know, do I see people like me represented in the neurodiversity paradigm as it currently stands in practice?
I don't personally feel that. I don't personally see that. Whether it's there or not, I'm not seeing it.
Yeah.
And I can say that for a number of other people as well. I don't speak for the whole ethnic population. But I can say that I can say that confidently that there are, you know, a significant a few. You know, it's a conversation that we've you know, consistently had, and I think that's really, really key. So whatever support and resources are being generated, for me, they don't appear to be reaching out to certain groups that are sitting on the periphery within the neurodiverse population. And so, you know, coming from the academic in me, the sort of professional in me, is saying, why is that? What is actually causing that? What is the triggering factor? And on this slide, I clearly say, well, you know, the question is the current neurodiversity paradigm reaching a point of unhealthy fragmentation? Is it the research and the effort and the work that is being carried out within the neurodiversity movement by those thought leaders that is potentially hindering some of that excess unintentionally? So what I question is the knowledge and the information that is going out there, is it equitable access? Is it reaching out and understanding the sentiments of all the people on the front line that are impacted and affected by neurodiversity? Is the research clusters involved within the research and the efforts and practice that is going on within the neurodiversity movement? Is there a low linkage point somewhere internally? So is it inadvertently bottlenecking resources and information that is going out? And so it sort of begs the question for me personally, is there a new direction, you know, that we should be going in? And, you know, one of the key questions that I'd asked you earlier is, are we at a pivotal point within the neurodiversity paradigm? And if so, what should we be doing to critically evaluate the progress that we've made so far, you know, in this neurodiversity space?
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really, really healthy question, and that's the question that that we want to bring up. So I think, you know, at that critical reflection time, you know, what is the reality of neurodiversity for most neuro minorities? And the reality at the moment is one of segmentation, which we could call segregation. It's certainly one where we've got a very low level of representation of different coloured faces in marketing material, in who the thought leaders are, in who is presenting, in who is talking, in who is writing, and in who is being asked to contribute. And I think, you know, with my practitioner head on at Genius Within, we work with businesses, we work with individuals who are at risk of unemployment. We also work with communities who are unemployed, and we work in several prisons across the south of England. And I'm really minded for the very harsh layering of marginalisation that goes on. And I don't know if anyone at this conference has heard the story of Simi Brown. So Simi Brown is a young man in the UK who is autistic, who is developmentally younger than his peers, and is currently in prison because he held a phone for a friend who, while he was holding the friend's phone, committed a robbery. And there's a law in the UK about shared endeavours, which is that if you aided and abetted a crime in any way, you get the same sentence as the person who perpetrated the crime. And this particular law is known to be particularly systemically racist and sexist. It's leading to very high rates of incarceration for female partners of male criminals. But in the particular case of Simi Brown, so he's developmentally younger than his peers, he's currently in prison, and he's currently scheduled for deportation to Jamaica because he arrived in this country age 5. And so you can imagine how absolutely devastating that would be for a young autistic person. To be suddenly, you know, gone from being prison alone, that's already kind of absolutely devastating. But potentially he's going to be released from prison into Jamaica, a country that he hasn't been in since he was 5 years old and doesn't have any close friends or relatives there. So that, you know, when we kind of contextualize these issues in the very harsh realities that people are facing every day, I think this really motivates me to try and address these problems and to try and kind of do better as a researcher and do better as a practitioner in providing access, inclusion, you know, making sure that what we're doing in Genius Within and in the research that we do at Birkbeck is kind of meeting a broader, more intersectional set of requirements. Because at the moment, I think we're very limited in our application in the neurodiversity movement. It seems to be something that you get to be part of if you are a certain type of human, and that hierarchy of who's part of the neurodiversity movement at the moment is also the social hierarchy that we're very familiar with. So, you know, thinking about, again, coming back to where do you go for research? Can I just thank Suzanne? I came on and listened to Suzanne's presentation, and Suzanne did, and I knew Suzanne was coming, so I knew that I didn't have to put in my presentation anything that we can learn from the disability inclusion paradigm, because I knew Suzanne would already bring it, and she brought it, and it was amazing. So what we did instead, Uzma and I, is we looked at the diversity and inclusion paradigm. So given that the goals of the neurodiversity movement is one of inclusion, that's not new. So the idea of social inclusion isn't new. The idea of increasing diversity and representation in employment, that's not new. No one's made that up with recent programs. There's lots of people that have been doing that for quite some time. So Uzma and I have been reflecting on what can we learn from racial equity work, what can we learn from gender inclusion in the workplace, and how can we apply those principles in the neurodiversity movement. So what can D&I in general teach us? And what we've been talking about is this intersectional critique that we need to make, and racial equity work is very good at intersectional critiquing, and it's really raised the work of Kimberly Crenshaw. Those sort of authors have really raised our awareness of what intersectionality is, and to get us to particularly notice the implicit biases we have towards white, cis, straight, middle class, male presentation. And, you know, that's the situation we're in the neurodiversity movement. You need resources to get a diagnosis. You know, do you know that there's a statistically significant difference between the number of Tourette's with Tourette's prevalence, Tourette's diagnosis, sorry, not prevalence, Tourette's diagnosis in the USA is weighted towards white people. And that's not because Tourette's doesn't exist in Black Afro-Caribbean or Asian people in the USA or Hispanic people. It's because of the social injustices that are economic and access to the healthcare resources that can be diagnosed. So once we've accepted that critique within the neurodiversity movement, and I've got some references at the end for people who want to go and look at what I've been saying and kind of check that out for yourself. But once we've accepted that critique, there's some other things we can learn from racial equity work. And I've got some words for you, which I hope aren't going to be new, but they might be. I hope people have been doing a lot of racial equity work this year, particularly due to the very hard work of the Black Lives Matter campaign, who've really been very successful in increasing awareness and increasing the kind of desire to stand up and to kind of move forward on this. And here's some words. So we have virtue signaling, performance activism, tokenism, white savior syndrome, white fragility, and micro incivilities. And these concepts can be applied to neurominority exclusion. And I'm just going to kind of leave them there, really. I mean, a micro incivility is when you say something that you think is kind of okay, but it's not okay because you don't understand the background that goes with it. So, for example, one of my colleagues has pointed out to me recently this year that the call her as an Asian woman articulate is a micro incivility because it kind of you're very articulate for a brown person, do you know? So it's got that tone to it that she finds incivil. And even though that's not how I meant it, I need to know the history of colonialization, the history of marginalization to understand that kind of but or foray, considering you are, and this plays out in neurodiversity. Oh, you don't look autistic. I'd never guess you had ADHD. Oh, but you write so well for a dyslexic. And so we have all these things in neurodiversity as well. And we also have white fragility. We have neurotypical fragility. Well, I didn't mean it. I didn't mean to make those mistakes. I didn't mean to embarrass you. And now I have to take care of you being a little bit embarrassed. And so there's these kind of power dynamics that we can learn from in racial equity work. And there's lots of really good advice and guidance about calling in rather than calling out, and kind of, you know, taking problems to be worked through rather than kind of, you know, being fragile about them and pretending they didn't happen, about passing the mic and making sure minority voices are heard, and about doing the right thing behind the scenes. So the real thing for me with virtue signaling and performance activism is what's happening behind the scenes. So when you're not putting it on your marketing brochures, are you still doing it? And my real critique with Autism at Work at the moment is we've developed these programs for autism at work in order to prove the point that autistic people have talent. We've proved that point. But what we've also proved with having those programs in place was that our original recruitment techniques are wrong. So if our original recruitment techniques were able to identify effective work performance, autistic people wouldn't have been excluded in the first place. And so what we're missing is that authenticity of coming back round and changing ourselves, doing the work, educating ourselves on how we can be more inclusive. So thinking also about what works in the diversity and inclusion paradigm. Uzma, do you want to say a bit more about what we've learned that really worked in that paradigm?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I can see Mr. Colman is popping in and out. We're almost done, me and Nancy, don't worry. So what works? So from an organisational...
It's a great conversation, keep it going. Sorry.
Well, there you go. We've had the red, green light, Nancy.
Okay.
Okay, so from a business organisational psychology point of view, insights that we've drawn from is predominantly by work carried out by Quinetta Robertson. So this is something that Nancy shared with me, and I'm happy to sort of share that with anybody that's interested here as a reference. And what she has done is a literature review, synthesising findings on diversity and diversity management. And she's identified areas from a theoretical, empirical, and practice view, to help advance scientific knowledge about the meaning and substance and outcomes of diversity and its implementation in organizations specifically. So in summary, more about how businesses need to change in the universal sense while adopting more affirmative action programs. And this echoes with what Susanna had mentioned earlier before our talk. So from a resource perspective, Robertson identified the need for management accountability. And this is essentially, well, okay, they need to follow the law. They need to understand what is expected, what is the requirement to accommodate and provide these reasonable adjustments within the workplace from an environmental perspective for the individuals. And if that is not being done, holding them to account. And from the individual perspective, we found that amongst other sort of resources or interventions that are put in place, like neurodiversity awareness programs, etc., having these employee resource groups or working groups may not be as effective. However, coaching and mentoring from an individual level are the key processes that have had greater impact on performance and well-being. So I'm not going to go into too much because Susanna's already sort of covered that significantly. And overarching thing that we wanted to sort of just throw out there is what the discussion has led to so far is the fact that it's highlighted a need for a very much multimodal research paradigm from very, very different angles and lenses. So I'm just going to sort of stop it right there.
Thanks, Uzma. Thank you. So Genius Within is a social enterprise, a non-profit, and we exist to promote increased access, life outcomes and inclusion for our community that we represent, and we feel that we are part of, we are representative of as ourselves, and we advocate for neurominorities of all forms. And we have partnered with Birkbeck School of Organizational Psychology. We formed a research practice alliance, and what we're going to be focusing on over the next few years is an improved cycle of research. So I think at the moment research tends to fall into the hierarchy of evidence. If you're an empirical researcher, you know, the systematic review and the randomized control trial is at the top, and case studies and people's experiences at the bottom. I don't really see it like that. I see it as a cycle. I don't think it's a hierarchy. I think when you get to what the top of what that current hierarchy is, when you're answering the question, does it work? I think the next question is, who does it work for? So if we've got an intervention, who does it work for? But what's happening at the moment in neurodiversity is we're still answering the question, what is it? You know, so we're still here at sort of 1 o'clock on my circle going, what is it? What is neurodiversity? Let's scan the brains of children to find the bits that are broken. let's keep doing that until we can kind of say what it is. And meanwhile, people like Waseem Brown are being deported to Jamaica, and people's work-life balance is unsustainable, and people are marginalized in quite serious ways. So I think we need to go back a few stages in the research cycle in neurodiversity and say, right now, who is neurodiversity working for? Who is the neurodiversity paradigm working for? And if we've got some voices who aren't represented, and we know who those are going to be, then let's listen to those voices. Let's draw some research priorities that meet the needs of those missing voices. And then we start the research paradigm, the research cycle. So we go, right, this is what we need to know. Okay, let's formulate it. Let's find out how representative it is outside of our kind of interpretative, qualitative, small sample studies. Now let's kind of create some interventions. Now we'll measure them. Now we're back into empirical positive research. And now we're asking the question, do they reliably work? And then we need to go back and go, and so what? You know, so we did these interventions, so what? And so we're starting off to 2021 with this combined multi-method research paradigm, and we're very excited about it, aren't we, Uzma? So Uzma's doing her PhD at the moment at Birkbeck, and I and my colleague Almut McDowell are leading this research drive, which is a research practice alliance, and we're very excited about it, and that is pretty much all we have to say. I just want to leave you with this thought, which is my quote, that inclusion is a moral, a social and an economic imperative, and we all lose when human potential is squandered. And that's kind of one of the big pluses of the neurodiversity paradigm, is this idea that all human potential has value and all human potential should be advocated for and represented, no matter the minority. And I feel like if we apply the critical intersectional lens to our research design and our practice, we're going to move closer towards achieving that goal.
Nancy and Uzma, thanks very much. And just to say that Uzma has been answering some questions here on the text as we go, and I think has covered quite a lot of the bases. And Nancy, you have said that you can find you on the LinkedIn's Genius Within page,
Yes.
and you could answer questions around that. You've hit a chord here. There's a lot of people bringing up I think, empathizing with a lot of the content that you've talked about. People saying, you know, my psychologist who diagnosed me with ASD said, you have a job, you can't have ASD. There was issues around people mentioning things like tone policing, and there was a comment, Uzma, about, you know, the partners of people who have ADHD and where's the support for them in terms of trying to manage that. And I think your account of that really hit some chords here, but I'm not seeing too many questions, more about commentary on how many people enjoyed the talk. And as you say, Nancy, you can take the questions on the LinkedIn's Genius Within page.
There's some about gender dysphoria and prison population and kind of what is the mechanism by which neurominorities are disproportionately incarcerated. And I think that's a fascinating question. I'm a trained expert witness for the legal system, and the legal process itself is systemically exclusive. So the very way in which police and lawyers are trained to ask questions that will have several clauses in them that will drain working memory. So, you know, by the time the question is finished being spat out of that person's mouth, the dyslexic or the ADHD, the working memory compromise individual will have forgotten the first part of the question. So they'll answer clause 3, but not clauses 1 and 2. And then the policeman or the lawyer or the judge will infer that they were evasive and that they were trying to avoid the question. So that there's a minutiae to that, which really needs unpacking and decontextualizing. And I'd love to talk more about that. So if you search for Genius Within in LinkedIn, let's have a jolly good chinwag about all of it.
Nancy, Uzma, thank you ever so much for a great presentation. We are due a break, but we ate into a little bit of the break there, but I just think it was fascinating to keep that going. So thank you for that. We'll have a leg stretch